Good afternoon. On behalf of the Iranian and Middle Eastern Studies Center here at Sacramento State, I would like to extend a warm welcome to our audience, our guest speaker, and those joining us on the Zoom live stream. We are so happy you've joined us. I would also like to thank our co-sponsors from across campus, including the Department of Political Science, the Department of History, California Faculty Association, the Visiting Scholars Program, and the One World Initiative, in addition to the center's very first intern, Farah El-Masri. IMESC is deeply grateful for your support and collaboration. I'm Dr. Sahar Razavi, and I'm a faculty member in the Department of Political Science as well as the director of the center, a role I had the honor of stepping into after the retirement of its esteemed founder and former director, Dr. Bahman Fuzuni, in 2020. The mission of the center is to foster a better understanding of the peoples, cultures, and politics of Iran and the Middle East in the greater Sacramento region and Northern California. IMESC pursues this mission by promoting and supporting cultural and social events, forums, workshops, research, and courses, as well as building collaborative relationships with similar centers in the U.S. and abroad. Today, we are very pleased to host Mr. Kourosh Ziabari for a timely discussion about how media influence our perceptions of contemporary Iran. Ziabari holds a master's degree in international multimedia journalism from the University of Kent in the UK, as well as an undergraduate degree in English language and literature from Gilon University in Rasht, Iran. His articles appear in Asia Times, Foreign Policy, Al Monitor, The National Interest, Middle East Eye, The New Arab, and Democracy in Exile, among others. He is the recipient of the 2022 Professional Excellence Award from the Foreign Press Correspondents Association and a silver medal winner of the Prince Albert II of Monaco and United Nations Correspondents Association's Global Prize for coverage of climate change. An alumnus of the Chevening Scholarship from the UK's Foreign Office, Ziabari is the first journalist from Iran to be awarded a World Press Institute Fellowship by the University of St. Thomas since 1979. Last year, he covered the United Nations on a Dag Hammarskjöld Fund for Journalists Fellowship. Ziabari is a three-time finalist of the Kurt Schork Awards in International Journalism and has held several prestigious fellowships ranging from Stanford to the United Nations and the East-West Center, among others. Many of his recent articles report on the Islamic Republic's violent crackdown on the woman, life, freedom movement, including pieces on the Iranian government's targeted killing of children in the protests and the use of the death penalty and denial of due process as a deterrent to repress popular dissent. We are living in a time of intense polarization. With political machinations by governments come far-reaching downstream impacts on communities, especially those who have been put in harm's way by antagonistic political leaders whose top priority is geostrategic advantage at any cost. Under these conditions, we rely on media to tell us what the world beyond our reach looks like, what people we may never meet are like. But the flow of information is not, as we might hope, unimpeded by the interests of the powerful. Media representations are often responsible for great distortions and tragic misunderstandings. In such an environment, democracy cannot thrive. Journalists enable us to build connections with each other, to co-create meaningful democratic exchange in spite of those obstacles by bringing to light things that the powerful would prefer to shroud in darkness. Journalism is considered the world over to be the bedrock of democracy and vital for peace building because at its best, it can serve to protect us from manipulation by the powerful and promote justice for the vulnerable. On that note, I want to say that on Monday, 3 days ago, a pair of earthquakes rocked eastern Turkey and Syria, causing immense suffering and loss of life across the region. The death toll keeps rising. At last count, it was about 17,000 people, with many more expected in the coming weeks. People want to help, but many don't know where to turn. IMESC has put together a flyer with information about 3 well-respected and highly rated humanitarian and rescue organizations working around the clock in response to this disaster. Those flyers are posted around the auditorium and at the front entrance if you are interested. You will notice QR codes that you can scan with your smartphones for your convenience. IMESC is also hosting a Zoom presentation next month on March 8th in honor of International Women's Day. Somaye Kargar was until very recently a political prisoner in Iran's notorious Evin and Qarshak prisons. She was imprisoned on the charge of illegally founding and running the Osyan organization, which advocates against mandatory hijab and Sharia law. In April, we will have an in-person presentation by former Ambassador to Iran, John Limbert, who will discuss the future of U.S.-Iran relations. You can find more information about both those events and register for next month's Zoom presentation at csus.edu/imesc. Mr. Ziabari will give his presentation first, at which point we will open up the forum for questions. In the interest of time and efficiency, Farah will distribute note cards that you can use to write down your questions during the talk. Before the end of the presentation, we will collect the cards and I will present your questions to Mr. Ziabari. Now, without further ado, please join me in giving a hearty Sac State welcome to Kourosh Ziabari.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to visit the California State University, Sacramento, and meet you all. A special thanks to the Iranian and Middle Eastern Studies Center and Dr. Sahar Razavi for this kind invitation. I'd like to start my presentation by paying tributes to the memory of the late Mahsa Amini, the Iranian woman whose tragic death in police custody triggered a tectonic shift in the Iranian society and made the international community conscious of the struggles of the Iranian people for freedom and democracy. I salute the memory of all those who lost their lives since the beginning of the Women Life Freedom protest in Iran last September. I hope our conversation today is going to be a fruitful engagement. I'll try my best to respond to all questions to the best of my ability. The events of the recent months have shown a broad light on Iran and stimulated many people to research it, study it, and get to know it more intimately. Iran has usually been a news hotspot in the middle of what is a tense and turbulent region in the world. And today, it is generating even more interest. As such, the media coverage of the country is extensive, and there are competing and more often than not, conflicting narratives about it that are curated by the media for our international audience. There is a combination of historical, so at this point I should share my screen so that we can have the slides. Okay. I guess we will have time for question and answers at the end. My response to questions will be comprehensive. So let's start the presentation, at which point. So there is a combination of historical, cultural, geographical, security, and political elements that afford Iran a special importance. It's my first time using this clicker, so okay. And the contemporary geopolitical developments have made it particularly relevant to an international audience. Primarily, there is a civilizational aspect. Although there is no unanimity on the chronological order of the world's longest-running civilizations, the Persian Empire that at its height encompassed parts of the modern-day Egypt, Turkey, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and even India has existed as one of the most powerful and complex empires of the ancient world. As an independent state, some sources say its first acquisition of sovereignty in the Proto-Elamite period predates every country in the world. Then there is the major geopolitical imperative. The modern Iran is situated at the crossroads of three major continents and possesses vast energy reserves that not so many countries are blessed with. It sits on the fourth largest crude oil reserves in the world, the second largest natural gas reserves in the world, and overall is the fifth country in the world in natural reserves combined. So it's a resource-rich nation with astonishing potentials to unleash. It might be noteworthy that the Strait of Hormuz in the Persian Gulf is the most important choke point for global oil supply, and every day between 20 and 30% of the world's total oil consumption passes through this strategically important waterway that is controlled by the governments of Iran and Oman. This is an added layer of geopolitical importance. The events of the recent decades have transformed Iran into a critical element of the regional security, and it is impractical to visualize a secure and a stable Middle East without Iran's footprint. The cultural imperative should also be factored in. In addition to historical contributions to arts and sciences and being the provenance of numerous renowned scholars who revolutionized our understanding of literature, astronomy, mathematics, and medicine, Iran continues to be the wellspring of highly qualified academics and intellectuals. Iranian diaspora in different countries is being recognized as one of the most successful and dynamic expatriate communities worldwide, and the nation's human capital is indispensable. Therefore, we can agree that Iran is an important country, and it matters how we understand it. Obviously, for the global public, the most accessible and practical way to learn about Iran, as with any other country, is to rely on media narratives. We can browse through encyclopedias and read books for in-depth insights, but to recognize the nation's contemporary developments, media reports remain our most paramount sources of information. Scholars contend that there are a variety of means people draw on to learn about foreign countries, including talking to peers, watching news on TV, seeking information online, and reading newspapers. In his 2005 book, Globalization, Education, and Culture Shock, the British scholar Cedric Collingford notes, what young people learn about other countries are often the most obvious and crude of cultural images, referring to the standard depictions that the media perpetuate about different nations. In 1956, the British American economist and educator Kenneth E. Balding observed in his seminal book, The Image, Knowledge in Life and Society, that individual behavior is largely dependent on our personal images. Other scholars expanded on his work, noting that communities, like individuals, base actions on images. And the attributions we make about other geopolitical and geographical settings are predicated on how we perceive those countries without having visited them in person. What I'd like to explore today in this talk is the consequential impact of corporate media on shaping our perceptions of Iran, a country that is receiving increasing media attention in light of the rapidly shifting nature of its relationship with the international community, and its domestic developments that we have seen in recent months have been unprecedented and phenomenal. First, I'd like to note that the coverage of Iran in the international media is overwhelming in terms of quantity, actually. And if you're interested in world news, Iran is a name you run into frequently on the headlines. In 2013, an associate professor of international communications at Tel Aviv University, Elad Segev, surveyed 35 popular news websites in 10 different languages and analyzed a total of 845,700 news items to gauge the coverage of foreign countries in these news websites in these 10 different languages. His findings are spellbinding from an Iranian perspective. In the US-based news website's coverage of global affairs, Iran was the third most prominent country, receiving 5% of the overall foreign reporting. The same holds true about the Israeli media coverage, where after the United States and Palestine, Iran is the most important priority with 7.3% of the coverage. In the French news websites, Iran came first as a country receiving the most attention at 5.1%. Globally, Iran was ranked sixth with 3.9% of total foreign reporting. I didn't have access to more recent figures, but I'm confident the trends have shifted in favor of increased Iran coverage, especially after the landmark nuclear deal between Iran and six world powers, formerly known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, was signed in July 2015, drawing further attention to the country. Indeed, interest in the Iranian affairs grew after the former US President Donald Trump made opposition to the Islamic Republic a linchpin of his foreign policy, and his May 2018 withdrawal from the JCPOA rekindled debate about Iran in the international media. There are several major dailies in the United States and other Western countries that have a special Iran correspondents and report on the country's developments routinely. It was not long ago when multiple leading international broadcasters and broadcasters and newspapers had bureaus of large teams of broadcasters and reporters in Tehran, but many of them started to be expelled after the coming to power of a hardline president in 2005. The presence of a sizable international press corps on the ground enabled the coverage of Iran to be dependable, but the authorities played havoc with that possibility. Yet, despite the deepening disconnect between Iran and the international community, which by extension has undermined the ability of the foreign correspondents to access the country and report on it, interest in Iran hasn't dwindled. Quite the opposite, international reactions to the nationwide protests and uprising known as the Women's Life Freedom Movement that started last September showed how enthusiastic the world is to learn more about the stories of the Iranian people. But are the stories produced about Iran and shared with audiences helpful to a nuanced understanding representative of the realities of the country? How do corporate media affect our perceptions of Iran? Are there boilerplate narratives that are being reproduced, discouraging critical thinking? To respond to these questions, we should first establish that however professional and reputable a given media organization may be, the notion of absolute objectivity and impartiality is an illusion. And I say this as a journalist, we will be misguided to expect media to function without any bias in complete neutrality. In 1996, Richard F. Taflinger, professor of communications at the Washington State University, argued in a paper that objectivity in journalism is a myth, adding that as long as human beings gather and disseminate news and information, objectivity is an unrealizable dream. He expanded on how the human brain functions for collecting information based on perceptions of the outside world, concluding that while they are individuals who decide what constitutes news, what is newsworthy, and how news should be relayed, it is impossible to achieve unconditional objectivity. The example he gives is an interesting one, assuming a situation in which a pro-life or anti-abortion reporter is assigned by the editor to do a story on the latest abortion technology. The reporter may unconsciously write a sentence starting with the words, "The new method to kill the baby," which to an independent observer imparts the presence of partiality. By contrast, a pro-choice reporter, or one who supports the right to legal abortion, asked to report on the same story, may communicate the introduction of the technology using the words, "This new method to terminate the fetus." These variations of terminology significantly affect how the readers will end up construing the development. Imagine these editorial decisions are being made about a sophisticated, intricate subject matter as Iran on a daily basis and on larger scales. Do we know how these decisions are being made? How stories are vetted for publication or broadcasting? Why certain events are being brought to the forefront and many others are left behind? And why we are encouraged to consume the news the way we are seeing them and they are being presented? The answer is our ability to analyze editorial decisions is often quite limited. But we have many vehicles at our disposal to fact-check stories and evaluate them for accuracy and reliability. Every media organization, regardless of its credentials and reputation, has got funders and donors. We often hear editors saying the editorial side of their media outlet is totally independent of the business side and there's no overlapping of the resolutions on either side. This can be an appealing ideal, but in practice, it turns out that it is often so difficult to compartmentalize these decisions and ensure a media organization is not at the mercy of the ideology of its primary funders, or at least to some extent influenced by it. The influence of the benefactors of the content and production of the news is often described as a donor power or honor power. And there is an extensive body of scholarly research substantiating that editorial decisions are swayed by the individuals or groups who plow money into the media and enable their operation. Other than the impact of financiers, media organizations may be susceptible to the diktats of the governments under which they operate. Indeed, it's a given that in democracies, governments are not supposed to instruct the media how to work, what political line to toe, or in any way encroach on the sovereignty of the media. It is in authoritarian settings that governments feel entitled to make direct and explicit interferences. But we know from experience, corroborated by studies, that the state-sponsored interpretations of the concept of national interest play a role in how media, even in democratic settings, report on news, especially those originating from and pertaining to foreign countries. Let me give you an Iran-related example. In 2013, Jonas Siegel and Sarnaz Barfroush of the University of Maryland studied the coverage of Iran's nuclear controversy from 6 English-language publications: The Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, The New York Times, The Guardian, Financial Times, and The Independent. The conclusion they made was that these outlets framed the reporting of Iran's nuclear file such that the official narratives of the Western governments on the issue would be presented to the readers, offering the decision makers a narrow set of policy responses and recommendations, namely coercive diplomacy and war. This approach was analyzed to be oddly reminiscent of the coverage of Iraq in the lead up to the 2003 invasion of the country. Another example may also be illustrative of how the idea of national interest delicately and implicitly determines how media may react to news. We've all heard about the brouhaha surrounding the withdrawal of Prince Harry and his wife Meghan Markle from the British royal family. In a widely shared piece for the New York Times published on the 25th of January, the Turkish sociologist and writer Zeynep Tufekci explained why the British tabloids have embarked on a concerted campaign of vilifying the couple in a bid to defend the reputation of the late Queen Elizabeth. Obviously, there is no official working relationship between the British papers and the Buckingham Palace. But if you get to read between the lines, as Tufekci has done, there are long-standing ties between many of the correspondents covering domestic politics for these tabloids and the monarchy. And this camaraderie explains why Meghan faced backlash after airing allegations about racism in the royal family and why the coverage of Harry and Meghan was so unfavorable at home. The conclusion to draw here is that despite the professed commitment to independence and objectivity, media cannot rule out the reverberations of partisan interests, corporate interests, affiliations, and ideologies in their work, and how these elements rationalize their convictions, shaping their coverage. So let's try to address the core question directly. How do the media influence our perceptions of the contemporary Iran? To respond to the question, we need an analytical framework that helps us make sense of how media perpetuate images and ingrain preconceptions. There is a plethora of academic studies proving that media are contributing to the reproduction of national, ethnic, racial, and gender stereotypes and other forms of cliches. These cliches define how we perceive communities or phenomena about which our knowledge is limited. There's evidence to believe that skewed media representations not only promote public hostility toward other groups, but also lower the minority people's self-esteem. These portrayals encompass a wide range of subject matters. British scholars David McCarthy and Robin L. Jones showed in a 2016 paper published by the Journal of Sports and Social Issues that the language used by the English television commentators during the coverage of domestic soccer teams was different according to the race of the players, and that the television medium constructed negative images of Black soccer players through the descriptive narratives and metaphors adopted. In a 2010 paper, Abigail C. Sagoy and Kirsten Groys of the University of California, Los Angeles showed how media constructions of overweight and eating disorders have ended up associating obesity and negative attributes with negative attributes and low social status, and instead equated thinness with high social status and moral virtues. There are other ways stereotypes are concocted and disseminated. Marie Castaneda, a professor of communications at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, explained in a 2018 paper that asymmetrical video portrayals have put the community of Latinos in the United States at tangible risk, including physical violence and deportations. She argues that deficient diversity across media landscape has created a cultural context in which people of color are particularly viewed through a stereotypical lens. If I want to go on citing examples, I can do so indefinitely. The bottom line is that stereotypes introduced and reiterated by the media wind up indoctrinating often unfavorable qualities about a collective of people distinguished by their protected characteristics, and in essence, dehumanize them. When a community is dehumanized, it's much easier to make them subject to different political agendas. When it comes to the coverage of Iran in the international media, we are at times exposed to narratives that are overtly, if not deliberately, misleading and embed false equivalences and hasty generalizations into the audience's belief systems. For example, it is often broadly asserted in the Western media that Iranians despise the United States and as a population are deeply anti-American. This is simply untrue. One can argue that the Iranian government thrives on a visceral animosity toward the United States, and it has partisans who subscribe to that anti-US mentality. But the truth is that admiration for the US culture, including its literature, cinema industry, history, music, and landscapes, and overall the values and principles the United States represents is pervasive among the Iranian youths. Herbert London, the late conservative commentator and former president of the Hudson Institute, argued in a 2018 opinion piece for the Fox News website, which was indeed exceptional, that unlike their government, Iranian people are largely pro-American. You don't find this admission in the corporate media quite often. But London wrote, quotes, "By any stretch of the imagination, the most pro-American people in the Middle East, other than Israelis, are Iranians. This is despite the fact that Iran's Islamist dictatorship makes hatred of America the foundation of its foreign policy." Unquote. A retired US diplomat once told me if there is any natural ally for the United States in the West Asia region, it is certainly Iran, not Saudi Arabia. His assumption was that what underprops this political and potential alliance is the progressive liberal attitudes of the Iranian people, who, unlike the conservative Saudi society, are an outward-looking and westernized people despite their country's chronic isolation. Obviously, there are not talking points that we hear frequently about Iran in the media. But perhaps the most visible stereotype that has left the most indelible impact on the Western minds is the conflation of Iran and whatever it personifies with global terrorism. Drawing on the US government's designation of the Iranian government as a state sponsor of terrorism, it has become common in the mainstream media to conveniently badmouth Iranians as a violent people and associate the Iranian nationality with the concept of terrorism. In August 2019, on the sidelines of the G7 summit, then US President Donald Trump referred to Iran as the #1 nation of terror, a remark that offended many Iranians who took to social media to respond to him. What Trump said was quite unvarnished, as there were no reference to the Iranian government in his remarks, and it targeted the nation. There have been several instances of hate crimes on university campuses in different Western countries when students of Iranian origin have been called terrorists. This is certainly a byproduct of insensitive, unrefined illustrations of the country being cultivated by the media. The espionage thriller TV series Homeland, starring Claire Danes and Damian Lewis, largely depicts Iranians as terrorists, and the Shahs of the Sunset aired between March 2012 and August 2021 on Bravo cast the Persians as a vapid, indolent community. Homeland, for example, was so extreme in its framing of Iranians as violent that Fawaz Gerges, an American Lebanese academic at the London School of Economics and Political Science, said Homeland is poisonous to any attempt to bridge the divide between the two nations. He was referring to the relation between Iran and the United States. Indeed, I personally don't go as far as implying that the TV series can undermine ties between two nations, but in the context of Iran-US relations, these connections have been so fragile and brittle that even a cultural product can further erode them. The same effect can be sensed in the production of the 300 the movie, a 2006 epic historical action film directed by Zack Snyder that recreates in a fictionalized mode the Battle of Thermopylae and the Greco-Persian Wars dating back 480 BC. The movie portrays Iranians as wild, callous people, and is so extreme in its visualization that several online campaigns kicked off at the time of its release by Iranians who demanded an apology from the producers and held to its screening. Culture critic Anthony Oliver Scott wrote in the New York Times that its plot included racist undertones. Greek film critic Dimitris Danikas wrote in the daily paper Tanea that in the film, Iranian soldiers are portrayed as bloodthirsty, underdeveloped zombies. And by doing so, the producers have been stoking racist instincts in Europe and America. It's not my intention to debunk the stereotypes here or offer counter-arguments to the flawed talking points rehashed by the media. My analysis predominantly relates to dissecting how the media are influencing our perceptions of Iran. But there are some figures on the concept of transnational terrorism that I'd like to share here. In this specific case, they might be of interest to you. Cato Institute released a comprehensive policy analysis in May 2019 titled Terrorists by Immigration Status and Nationality, a Risk Analysis 1975 to 2017. The research detailing the countries of origin of individuals who carried out acts of terror on the US soil found that between 1975 and 2017, a total of 12 Iranian-born terrorists were identified in the United States. Their activities resulted in 0 deaths, meaning that Iranian-born terrorists killed no US citizens in this period. By contrast, within the same time frame, 16 Croatia-born terrorists murdered 3 people, and 18 Saudi Arabia-born terrorists were responsible for 2,351.8 murders. A total of 9 Egypt-born terrorists murdered 160.8 US and non-US citizens. The non-whole figures here are because number of victims of a single incident was divided equally among multiple perpetrators. Yet you scarcely get to see any of these countries being described by the mainstream media as terrorism sponsors or their citizens as having a propensity to violence. Indeed, there are complicated conversations about the way governments conduct themselves and define their approach to terrorism and exporting violence overseas. That will be a long-winded conversation for another forum. But to sum up, I just want to make the point that even when there are countries whose nationals are convicted of being involved in actual acts of terror, that doesn't automatically translate in a negative media narrative coalescing around those countries. One of the other fallacies that the media often rehearse is the innuendos they make about Iran being a monolithic, hierarchical society in which people live the same lifestyle, think within the same intellectual prism, share the same cultural backgrounds, and are so amenable to government inculcation that whatever the religious authorities propagandize, they accept and adhere to. Some of these mantras were dispelled through the coverage of the Women Life Freedom protests, and the world realized how ethnically and culturally diverse the Iranian society is and how brave its people are, defying the government's iron fist and its brutal crackdown. But the idea of Iran being a homogeneous, obedient nation that has long been hardwired into the Western audience's talking process, often communicated to them through flood messaging and imageries has been there. In addition to these fallacies, our understanding of Iran is overshadowed by what I'd call an implicit dehumanization of the Iranian people. The lion's share of the media coverage of Iran is centered on the politics of the country and its intransigent government. Before the September 2022 protests started, the reporting was almost exclusively geared toward Iran's nuclear standoff. So, if as external observers, we rely solely on the corporate media to decipher the Iranian affairs without any background knowledge, all we would know was that this is a country with an adventurous nuclear enterprise that is threatening global peace and security. In this discourse, it doesn't matter if there are leading Iranian artists, for example, who are transforming our world and making seminal contributions to the global cultural scene, or Iranian scholars breaking new grounds in the academic institutions in the West wouldn't be the focus of attention. The stories of Iranian youths going above and beyond and making innovations to break away from the isolation their government has imposed on them and connect with the outside world wouldn't be reported to an audience that is saturated with gloomier stories about the escapades of the Islamic Republic. This is how an entire population ends up being dehumanized and over time consigned to oblivion. Dehumanization also serves political objectives and can be a precursor to resolutions governments make for a variety of purposes. University of California, San Diego sociologist John Hyde even says, before we enter into warfare or genocide, we first dehumanize those we want to eliminate. In her book, Ethics in an Age of Terror and Genocide, political scientist Kristen Monroe also argues that psychological dehumanization is a prerequisite for genocidal aggression, and that moral psychology works through the reclassification of the other to determine our response to another's suffering. Indeed, there's no evidence that Iranians are being deliberately dehumanized in preparation for a violent modus operandi. And I'm not inculpating the corporate media for being involved in such a pursuit. But this is a foregone conclusion that continued and consistent attempts at dehumanizing a population, regardless of their striking distinctions and differences, would make it easier for them to be the subject of repression at home and infringement of their rights and violence on behalf of external actors. Another pitfall in the media coverage of Iran, which impinges on our perceptions of the country, is that even though there is a lot of conversation about the Iranian people and their aspirations, there's a lingering disconnect between the media reports and the people inside the country, those who are physically its inhabitants. The preponderance of those who are interviewed as experts, analysts, or commentators in the mainstream media, the stories are either Iranians based overseas or non-Iranians. The implication is that roughly 85 million Iranians within the country's geographical borders are divested of their agency and expression. It is as if they are a bankrupt entity who should be represented by some spokespeople to talk to the media on their behalf. When you engage in conversations with people in Iran, whether they are ordinary citizens or informed sources, you will notice that there are marked divergences between what they think and feel and what the sources outside the country would tell you in reaction to the current affairs. The country is so heterogeneous and diverse in terms of the people's demographic and intellectual backgrounds that the way they frame developments is sometimes starkly different from how the members of the Iranian diaspora would articulate them, or the way experts in the London, New York, and Washington, D.C. think tanks would describe. And the caveat is that many of these people who have developed a reputation as being leading experts on Iran are handicapped by their restricted personal experience with the country. They either don't speak the language or haven't ever been to Iran, or by virtue of being affiliated with institutions whose partisan agenda surpass their credentials, cannot offer broad-ranging and inclusive commentaries. And the chronicles can be quite lopsided at times. This is why critics and journalists alike keep saying that there is a scarcity of authentic voices coming from Iran in the media coverage of the country. There are two reasons involved. First, this absence of authentic voices is the outcome of the government's strict policies in licensing foreign correspondents, which means the country has been drained of the best international journalists to report on the country, and who used to produce on-the-ground, first-hand reporting there and are no longer given the permission to function. Also, we are facing the pervasiveness of lazy journalism and the fact that despite the entire spectrum of restrictions surrounding the coverage of Iran as an insular society, we as journalists are still not doing our best to make sure our work reflects what is happening inside the country, and we continue to rely on speculations about what might be happening or what might happen in the future. So, is it a fair assessment to say the media are influencing our perceptions of Iran entirely negatively or distorting the realities of life in the country? Of course not. But what I would assert is that given the luxury of resources at their disposal and the investment being made in the work, their performance is certainly inadequate and not conducive to an exhaustive cognition. We cannot rely on the mainstream media reports of a rapidly evolving Iran and come to realistic judgments. They make us informed and lift the veil on much of what would remain undisclosed otherwise without the reporting. But they also leave us with many unanswered questions and sometimes undermine our critical thinking because of their oversized reliance on stereotypes and excessive use of fallacies. I didn't cite examples of published materials or broadcast material to pinpoint their demerits, but on a daily basis, browsing online publications, leafing through the pages of newspapers, and tuning into different radio and TV broadcasters, I find countless instances of arguments from incredulity, arguments from repetition, appeals to emotion of fear, semantic stop signs, circular reasonings, and incomplete comparisons that only end up confusing our perceptions of Iran. This can certainly apply to any other country, but on a hotly debated setting and context, such as Iran, we definitely need more nuanced and accurate reporting. To be sure, independent and freelance journalists are often doing a great job covering underreported stories of the country, sometimes going to great lengths to produce indispensable investigative journalism, exposing the good and bad of the country. But I should make this admission that freelancers are not the ones playing the primary role shaping the debates, and there is still the mainstream media and their staff who determine what the narrative should look like and why the trajectory of the reporting is what we see today. As journalists, I often critique my own work before getting to a point where I feel the reader's trust is declining. We should scrutinize our output and our practices frequently and more rigorously than any other observer. Also, I never acquiesce to being a blind advocate of what I do or the industry I'm involved in. Rather, my approach has usually been built on identifying the vulnerabilities that undermine journalism and stain the credibility of the reporting. For that reason, I keep inquiring into journalism through a critical lens. In today's complex and interconnected world, we need journalism to understand people, communities, territories, and phenomena. Journalism helps us sense the realities and trends without experiencing them. At the same time, journalism has never been more difficult with so many authoritarian regimes targeting the people in the media industry and mobilizing all the resources and suppress free and independent media. Even in democracies, threats to journalists are on the rise at an unprecedented pace. These attacks underline the salience of the smooth functioning of the media. I try to present a pathology of how the media are influencing our perceptions of the contemporary Iran based on my observations as a regular follower of the media coverage of the country, but also as a journalist whose work is centered on Iranian issues. This debate can be much more in-depth and encyclopedic, and it can be better illustrated with samples of how media reports affect the psychology of our interpretation of events as they unfold, not only in Iran, but in every context. I hope with further contributions by all those who are concerned about ethical, factual, and accurate reporting, this debate can be sustained and continued. Thank you very much.
Other questions going to the director, you can ask later.
I've consolidated the questions here. I'll be
And
presenting.
not for the speaker, we have other questions for the director and the advisory council. They're going to ask those questions probably.
Sure. I welcome them. Okay, so I'm going to just
Sure.
pose the question to you. I don't know.
Thank you very much for your presentation. We have a lot of excellent questions here, and I want to consolidate some of them because some of the questions were the same. The first is, even though your presentation wasn't specifically to tell us about what's happening in Iran, quite a few people want to know more about it. So if you can tell people who may not be as familiar with the events of the last 4 or 5 months, that would be great. A synopsis of what is happening. Another question is, what do you think is going to happen next? What do you think, what do you predict is going to be the outcome of this revolution? People are calling this revolution uprising. And what are the kind of consequences for Iranians inside the country, Iranians outside the country, and what do you think is going to happen with the government? Some other people ask, since you are an expert in the field, what do you think are the most reliable sources in the United States or outside of Iran? What are the most reliable news sources that people can turn to that they feel that they would be able to trust? We're going to
I'm
pause
taking notes
there.
actually.
We'll pause there and then
Yeah,
you
sure.
have a chance to respond to those.
Okay. So in terms of what's been happening in the country, I guess the global media coverage of the uprising in the recent months has been quite comprehensive and eclectic. So I just find it difficult to ingest and summarize the entire travails and tribulations of the recent months in just 2 sentences, but we all know that it has been one of the very defining junctures of the Iranian history, of the Iranian contemporary history, and it has been a dramatic shift in the social dynamics. Of course, the uprising was triggered by what was perceived as an injustice and police brutality, but then it evolved into a further movement aimed at challenging the entirety of the establishment. But what it's headed, I mean, I don't have a crystal ball, and I find it difficult to predict. I don't really delve into prognostications to just say that what's happening to the future of a certain country or a certain movement. It's not my job as a journalist. I report on what's happening, and I find it detrimental to the prospects of a democratic uprising in any setting to say where it's headed or where it might end up. But my understanding is that for any reason, I mean, we were seeing that the uprising and the protests of recent months have subsided, and there are no longer street demonstrations or gatherings on university campuses. But this has been by far a success for the Iranian people, who proved their resilience, their courage, their devotion, their aspiration for democracy and freedom. So this is, I mean, my understanding of the situation is with the complexity of forces, with how the government is continuing to unleash its brute force. Again, I find it difficult to predict, and I don't really do that as a journalist. And I think there is a fine line between journalism and activism. At any point, I let my personal biases and personal convictions to sway my reporting. I will just cease to be a journalist. I will start being an activist. But in terms of the future, I see that, I mean, the potentials of the Iranian people are not concealed. They're well known to everyone. Even the former U.S. President Donald Trump once referred to the Iranian community in the United States as one of the most successful diaspora communities he has ever seen. This is a president whose, I mean, hostility to the Iranian government was quite pronounced. But in terms of the reliable sources, I mean, again, I don't name names, but personally, I mean, I read up to 10, 15 newspapers and magazines per day to make sure that I gather the pulse of what's happening in the media, how the coverage is being shaped and germinated. Well, I mean, ranging from the Fox News to the CNN, ranging from the Associated Press to foreign policy, I read everything, but I think it's up to each of us individually to make our own judgments about the media coverage. This is something that I wanted to delve into later in one of my other presentations, but I can just quickly mention that as readers, as audiences, we need to rely on our own judgments and don't let media experts, media commentators, journalists judge for us. Think instead of us, be in our shoes and decide our future actions, our future sentiments. So I think I listen to people I disagree with. I read people I disagree with. I read newspapers that I believe are entirely substandard and non-professional. But this is what I guess an informed reader should do. If we, cloister ourselves in an echo chamber where we simply hear what we like to hear, then I guess that's not a good sign. We need, when we talk about diversity, when we talk about plurality, when we talk about the multiplicity of voices, we need to translate it into action. And as individual readers, start having critical conversations with ourselves. Have I been reading enough of that? For example, if I'm a leftist, have I been reading enough of that far-right outlet so as to gauge what their policies? That can apply to any other realm, but so far, I guess I responded to what has been posed. So,
thank you. There are two related questions that came up several times. One is, who stands to gain from the negative perception of Iranians that we talked about? One thing that was very pronounced in your presentation was that there is a big difference between the government and the people of Iran. And you described in this Q&A, you said that the movement that's happening right now is for democratic freedoms, and you described the government of Iran as an Islamic dictatorship. But in the media representation in the West, often there is no distinction made between the people and the government. And a lot of negative perceptions are then felt downstream when there is racism, for example, directed toward ordinary Iranian Americans here in the United States. So who do you think stands to gain from these types of distortions? And what do you think are the consequences ultimately of that? And relatedly, to what extent do you think the brutality and the violence of the Islamic Republic is responsible for those negative perceptions? And to what extent are those negative perceptions a result of other kinds of distortions